Okay, I think we are at the half an hour. Welcome, everyone. It's a true honor, a privilege, and certainly what a wonderful community we have together here. Restorative Justice on the Rise is your host tonight for, as you can see, this public Zoom dialogue. Thanks so much for being here. And of course, we'll be talking with Kazu Haga tonight. And before we start, I'd just like to make a correction. In the materials I sent out to our networks, the dialogue was promoted as Healing Resistance, a radically different approach to harm. And in the subtitle of the book, I just want to make sure that everybody knows it's actually a radically different response to harm. And of course, it's very appropriate. Response has so many restorative implications to it. I'm super excited to be with you all tonight. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started. And again, I'm Molly Rowan Leach. I'm the founder of Restorative Justice on the Rise. As you can see on the shared screen there, we have a podcast that has been going since 2011. It was inspired by witnessing the brokenness of our criminal justice systems and, of course, the ongoing brokenness of our colonized systems. Dialogue and information sharing inspired action is a part and driving factor of why we do this work and continue. And it's been such an honor to have guests on our show, such as Kazu tonight. And Kazu, you might appreciate that we've talked with Dr. Johan Galtung, a mutual colleague, James O'D, and of course, Michelle Alexander, who has deeply praised this book of yours, and for good reason. So welcome, everyone. Tonight's session is going to be about an hour and 15 minutes. And we're going to open up tonight, if you wouldn't mind turning off your video just for the first part of our time together so that Kazu and I can have a little bit of a dialogue, and then we're going to open it up to interaction with you. So no worries if you don't get a chance to turn off your video right away, but just know that we'll be going into interaction in just about a half an hour into the dialogue. So as you can again see on the screen, I want to point out that there's a wonderful opportunity to support a very important cause at Parallax Press. So if you haven't already picked up a copy of Healing Resistance, please go to Parallax Press specifically, because one book, once you buy one book, or if you buy two books, two will be donated to an incarcerated person. This is an ongoing thing that is being offered and such an important cause. So if you're going to buy more copies, please go do that at Parallax Press specifically. And for more information about the book itself, you can go to healingresistance.com. And you can see Restorative Justice on the Rise has a podcast. We're at restorativejusticesontherise.org. If you have not had a chance to get involved with our email list to be updated on podcasts and other events, please do so. So without further ado, I just want to give some background on this amazing person we're lucky to hear from tonight, Kazu Haga. Kazu is not just an amazing writer, he's many other things. He's the founder and coordinator of the East Point Peace Academy, and he's a core member of the Ahimsa Collective and the yet to be named network, and author of the book, which we're discussing tonight, Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm. And of course, many of you know the Ahimsa Collective for their incredible work within prisons, healing dialogues, and they were featured actually in the Redemption Project, which was the CNN series last year that we had the honor of having discussions around after each episode. So the Ahimsa Collective is also Sonia Shah. Many of you might know Sonia, incredible woman doing incredible work. Based out of Oakland, but she's doing a lot worldwide. So Kazu is also an experienced trainer He's certified in several methodologies of nonviolence and restorative justice. He's received training from elders, so honoring the elders, including Dr. Bernard Lafayette, Reverend James Lawson, and Joanna Macy, to name a few. And he teaches nonviolence, conflict reconciliation, restorative justice, organizing and mindfulness in prisons and jails, high schools and youth groups, and with activist communities around the country. Kazu was introduced, sorry about that, to the work of social change and nonviolence in 1998, when at the age of 17, he participated in the interfaith pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And I'm going to pause there because we're going to hear from Kazu a bit about that story. And just share that he's also spent 10 years working in social justice philanthropy while directly being involved in and playing leading roles in many movements. He became an active nonviolence trainer in the global justice movement of the late 1990s and has since led hundreds of workshops worldwide. He's an avid meditator and enjoys being in nature, particularly with his dog. He is a diehard fan of the Boston Celtics and of mixed martial arts, the latter of which he is still sometimes conflicted about. And one thing I'd like to do, Kazu, before I invite you in for a little dialogue here, is I'd like to share with people the extraordinary events that you have going on at the East Point Peace Academy, if I may. So I'm just going to give a quick screen share here. You have a lot of ongoing things happening online in these times, which I really appreciated, and I think people would be interested to hear about. So if you aren't already in tune and updated with the East Point Peace Academy, check out their upcoming trainings and events, including the upcoming Finding the Ways Between, a weekly nonviolence practice group, an event with Mushim Aikida from WTF to Please Tell Me More, skillful speech in a polarized world. And of course, there's more as you scroll down. So Kazu, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us tonight. And just a deeply warm welcome and bow to you for your book, for your work, and for your life.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was fun to see the picture of myself on the screen pre-COVID, and now I haven't shaved or gotten a haircut since the lockdown started, so it was fun to see that.
So I wondered if you might be willing, I paused as I was introducing you, because I think the power of story and inspiration behind people like yourself is so important to begin the journey together tonight. Would you be willing to share with us what inspired you, what got you into the work that you do, and of course, you know, decades later where you're at now, but what was the seed for you?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And yeah, thank you again for having me and for everyone that's on the call, including even Maureen, who's calling in from Laker Nation, which, you know, as a restorative justice practitioner, I always struggle with there. But yeah, no, so I'm grateful that you kind of like paused at the part of my bio that talks about the pilgrimage. So I am one of those rare people that can point to like the exact day that everything shifted in my life. And that day was May 1st of 1998. Prior to that, I had been in a place where I was really struggling. I dropped out of high school when I was 15, and I grew up in a home where there was a lot of violence and conflict. And the way I responded to that, as with a lot of young people who are in those situations, is I turned to drugs and alcohol. And for a couple of years after I dropped out of high school, I was just doing nothing productive with my life. And it was at a point in my life where, you know, had I met a military recruiter, I would have gone off to war. Had I met a cult leader, I would have joined a cult. Had I lived in a large urban setting, I might have joined a gang. And luckily for me, instead of a military recruiter or a cult leader, I met a group of Japanese Buddhist monastics, these monks and nuns who were really dedicated to the work of nonviolence and social change. And they were organizing this thing called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And their idea was to walk from Massachusetts all the way down the coast to New Orleans, and then eventually down the coast of Africa to retrace the Middle Passage, to retrace the slave route. And their understanding was that the racism that we deal with in this country today is a direct result of not having reconciled and healed from the legacy of slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples. And so until we go all the way back and begin to unpack and heal from those legacies, then we're never going to be able to address any of the issues around race and racism and white supremacy that's manifesting today. And, you know, I was just this 17-year-old kid who was bored, and I had never done anything in my life like that. And I heard about this pilgrimage about a week before it started, and I just thought it was an interesting thing. And I think more than anything, it was an opportunity to get out of town. I was bored. And so I told my mom I would check it out for the first week. And I essentially left home for a year and a half, not knowing that that's what was going to happen. I ended up going all the way to New Orleans with the monks and nuns, and then ended up spending a year living in their monasteries in South Asia, in Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, studying Buddhism, studying nonviolence. And so my introduction to Buddhist practice, my introduction to nonviolence, my introduction to social change and activism all started there with this really deep understanding of the need to go all the way back in history and the need to heal from these traumatic events that we go through as individuals and as collectives in order for us to move forward. So yeah, that was a life altering period of my life, obviously.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. So Kazu, one of the things that I've been thinking about in prep for our time together, I love the way that you remind us of the differences between non-dash violence and non-violence. So before we dive in a little bit more about the book, can you share with us what you mean, what is meant by that? Because some of, you know, myself included, what you unpacked really was helpful coming from you to understand that. So non-dash violence is different from non-violence, all one word. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, nonviolence is a tricky word, right? Because when you look at the word, you think all it's saying is something is not violent, something is the absence of violence. And so within the world of Kingian nonviolence, we make a really important distinction between nonviolence with the hyphen and without the hyphen. Because when you put the hyphen in the word, what that does grammatically is it separates the word and it turns it into two words, right? When you hyphenate the word, all that says is something is not violent. And I always argue that the idea that nonviolence is simply about not being violent is the biggest and most dangerous misunderstanding that exists of the concept of nonviolence. And the story that I write about in my book is actually right outside of my window where I'm sitting right now. About 8-9 years ago, there was a fight going on outside. And, you know, I live in a neighborhood where people are screaming and hollering all the time. And so I was trying to just ignore it and go back to sleep. But this fight kept escalating and it kept getting louder. And I finally decided to get out of my bed and look down the window, and there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. And not only was she getting beat, but she was screaming for help. And so I jumped up out of my bed and I put on my shoes. I ran downstairs. I opened up the gate. And by this point, they had gone across the street to the other corner and it was still going on. So I ran across the street and I broke up this fight. And by the time I got down there, about 15 of my neighbors had all heard the commotion, and they had all come outside of their homes and their apartments, and they were just watching this woman get beat, not doing anything to intervene, not doing anything to help. And I always argue that all of my neighbors who were just standing around watching this woman get beat were practicing non-hyphen violence, in the sense that they weren't being violent, right? They were explicitly being not violent. And in fact, you can even make the argument that I was being more violent than my neighbors were because I used a certain amount of physical force to separate the two parties. And so you can see how big of a difference in our understanding of that word it can make when you think of nonviolence as just the absence of violence. And like, that's what we see a lot in our society today is when we see, you know, unarmed killings of Black folks, or we see mass incarceration, we see rises in homelessness. And we have this tendency to be like, oh, that's none of my business. And just be a bystander to injustice. But nonviolence isn't about what not to do. It's really about when you see violence and injustice in your community, what are you going to do about it to try to transform that situation? And so the hyphen makes it even more, it makes it seem even more like what we're talking about is just the absence of violence or the absence of action.
Wonderful. Thank you for unpacking that. I think it's a good context to start diving into the book. And again, for those of you just joining us, welcome, warm welcome to you all. We have a wonderful participant base tonight from all over the place, including international locations. So welcome to you all. We'll be getting into some interaction with Kazu after another 20, 30 minutes or so of interview time. We really wanted to take time to hear from you and interact with you tonight. So we'll be going into that shortly. Kazu, so I know we wanted to talk about the reason why you wrote this book. I'm also really curious to hear from you about the concept of negative peace, but why don't you frame for us right now, what is the reason you felt like this book was so important to write? And I know there's, if I may just share with people, another edition coming up that's going to go even more deeply. So, but tell us about Healing Resistance and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so Healing Resistance is really an exploration into this training philosophy that's been at the foundation of my life for the last 10 years or so, called Kingian Nonviolence, Conflict, Reconciliation. And it was based on the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. I've had the privilege to spend time with elders from the civil rights movement who work closely with King. And so part of it was just like this, I had been doing nothing but social change work for 10 years of my life before I found out about Kingian nonviolence. And then I took this 2-day nonviolence training back in 2009, I think it was. And it just completely changed everything I thought I knew about social change, everything I thought I knew about nonviolence, about the legacy of Dr. King. And it's since become like the lens through which I view the world. And so part of it was just my desire to contribute back to the legacy of Kingian nonviolence, but also, as a social change, as someone who's committed to social change, as someone who's committed to the work of nonviolence, like there was so much misunderstandings about what the word nonviolence meant. But also in a lot of social justice movements, I see people, even movements that are so-called nonviolent, use nonviolence or use direct action, use organizing strategies to leverage power, and then to use that power to shove change down the throats of the people that we don't agree with. And to me, there's our organization, we have teams of nonviolence trainers within incarcerated populations in several prisons throughout California. And one of our incarcerated trainers once said that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And as people who do restorative justice work, we understand that what we're trying to do is not just fix issues, but repair relationships, right? And, I kept seeing movement after movement after movement that was only focused on fixing the issue, in the sense of like, this is the legislation that we need to pass, this is the new policy that we need to get across, but we're not doing anything to repair relationships between the communities that have been at odds. And if we're not doing that work of repairing relationships, then there's always going to be new conflict. And so if we want to build sustainable peace, then we need to be doing the work of repairing relationships, both in these like small scales during restorative dialogues, as well as at scale when we engage in social movements. And so I'm hoping that the book contributes to us being able to build powerful social justice movements that are not just about like this piece of legislation, but really about repairing relationships.
Absolutely. It's so, it's actually one of my most passionate links, if you would like to call it that, between movements would be between nonviolence, nonviolent communication, and restorative practices and justice, because of the fact that it appears that it's one of the only avenues to really go underneath the conflict, the issue, and give a chance for the unmet needs and the associated feelings, which are valid, to be explored and acknowledgement of them. So I really appreciate that you're looking at the epigenetics of harm, the intergenerational trauma of harm. Very curious to hear more about that as it applies to the current predicament that we're in of such violence, and recognition of the 400 plus years violence we've committed upon the Black community and persons of color, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and more. So that's a lot in a sentence, but what it leads me to want to share is to unpack a bit from the book. I'd like to just share with everybody a quote from the book, and then Kazu, you can comment. So you say, King once said, Dr. King once said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." Riots are ultimately a cry for peace from communities who have never had it. To condemn oppressed people for lashing out against centuries of violence is to ignore the larger context of violence they are lashing out against. It is the inevitable response from a community whose pain had gone unacknowledged for centuries. Calls for Black Lives Matter protesters to be peaceful following the latest police killing can be a form of repression. It is a call for peace that acts as a euphemism for stop complaining and stay in your place. Peace is messy, justice is loud. If we expect that creating peace in a society as violent as the United States will be a neat, calm, and quiet process, we will be in for a rude awakening. That's such a potent couple paragraphs, and then I'll just close with a bit from the following one. You say, real peace building requires us to learn to have the conversations we don't want to have with our families and with society. So I'll stop there and just ask you to respond to that in the current context that we're amidst.
Yeah, lots I could say to that. You know, that a lot of that comes out of an uneasy feeling that I always get when there's violence that happens in response to the latest police killing and there's all these calls for peace. And to be clear, like, I'm a nonviolence trainer and a nonviolence practitioner. And I believe that ultimately only a nonviolent movement can create the sustainable positive peace that we're after. And at the same time, you know, when we see particularly young Black and brown people lash out in violence, like, we have to ask the question, like, what is driving them to do that? What is behind that rage and that anger? And if you think about the fact that, you know, the Black communities in this country have known nothing but violence at the hands of the state for 400 years, and they've never been given an opportunity to take a breath from that. It's almost like, well, what do you expect? Like, if you don't give an entire community any sense of peace for 400 years, then obviously they're going to lash out, right? And they're lashing out because they are the ones that are sick of the violence that they've had to live with, right? And so I always say that when Black and brown communities, quote unquote, riot, it may not be the most effective way of bringing about long-term transformation and healing, but at the end of the day, it is a cry for peace. Like, they are, like, young people are taking to the streets because they are sick of the violence that their communities have had to live with for 400 years, and they want peace. They want some semblance of peace in their lives. And, you know, it's important for us to remember that Dr. King was arrested 29 times in his life, and half of those times he was charged by the US government for disturbing the peace, right? Because a lot of the work of nonviolence is about being able to engage in these really difficult conversations that we don't want to have. And these conversations are messy. Like, we're trying to unpack the real legacy of slavery and how it continues to impact this country. And conversations about the legacy of slavery and about white supremacy is not going to be an easy, clean, quiet conversation. It's going to be really messy. And nonviolence is about not being afraid to have those messy conversations. And from the outside looking in, it may look like we're creating the mess when we're really just bringing it to the surface so we can deal with it. And so, yeah, Dr. King was arrested and accused throughout his entire life for disturbing the peace. But in nonviolence, we say that, when we're engaged in nonviolent action, we're not disturbing peace, we're disturbing complacency, and we're disturbing the normalization of violence, and we're disturbing this concept of negative peace that you mentioned.
Thank you. I am noticing quite a few comments in the chat. Thank you, everybody. We'll be addressing those and welcome you in whatever way you would wish to converse with Kazu in just a little bit here. But Kazu, this idea of negative peace and the actual aspect of it, I mean, it's a thing. It's not just an idea. It happens all the time. It happens within movements that are well-meaning all the time. How do you see restorative justice having a stronger, let's say, chance at getting underneath this, it's almost a sinister aspect of well-meaning movements of negative peace? So from your perspective, restorative justice, does it have a really better chance at addressing and pushing back on this thing that seems so pervasive?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just start by making a shameless plug. You mentioned that I'm working on another book. So the second book that I'm working on is called Fierce Vulnerability. And it's really about infusing everything that I've learned from my time in doing restorative justice work with this lineage of nonviolent direct action and nonviolent movement building work. And what would it look like if we viewed even like militant forms of nonviolent direct action as a modality in trauma healing? Because I think, in the restorative dialogues that I facilitate, there's with the Ahimsa Collective, I facilitate a group in Valley State Prison, or I did before COVID. We'll see what happens with everything, because of course all the prisons are locked down right now. And we were working with men who have like significant trauma, right? And particularly trauma around the experiences of sexual harm. And having experienced sexual harm on both sides as survivors and as people who perpetuated it. And as we know, like sexual harm amongst all the different forms of violence, it is one of the forms that has so much shame wrapped up in it. And especially in a place like prison, there's so much shame wrapped up in that experience that there's no space to talk about it. And part of the work of restorative justice, I think, is creating containers that are safe enough for people to speak to the things that they are perhaps most ashamed of. Because there's a beautiful quote that says, shame derives its power from being unspoken. Like when we're not able to speak to our shame, then it ends up controlling our lives. But when we are able to confront our shame directly, it's incredibly liberating. And I think restorative justice creates those containers. And I think what we're trying to do with nonviolent direct action and social change is create a container where the country feels safe enough to speak to its shame. Because this country should be ashamed of the legacy of slavery and the legacy of colonization, and we need to learn to talk about it. But you see how every time the conversation starts, how a vast majority of the country just has these like defensive walls that go straight up, and we refuse to have the conversation. And so, I'm definitely interested in how restorative justice and restorative practices can create containers where people feel safe enough to have these scary conversations about the legacy of this country.
Mm. You mentioned that, the country that you were born in, Japan, is conflict averse.
Yes.
Would you say that the United States is also similar in its conflict aversion? And what is your relationship, or what do you think the relationship is possibly between defensiveness, denial, and negative peace?
Yeah, I think there's, I've only lived in Japan and the United States, so I should only speak from those experiences. I think both countries are conflict averse in some ways, but they manifest very differently. In Japan, we just like to swallow it and repress everything. And I think in the States, the States, there's so many different cultures within this so-called country, right? But I think oftentimes conflict manifests in this country in this very like externally projected way. And it manifests as physical forms of violence or verbal violence, and that's actually not dealing with the conflict either, right? It's actually projecting a lot of the defensiveness and our inability to have these conversations in a real meaningful way, and so yeah, in some ways you could argue that that is just a different way of being conflict averse, of just like choosing, or yeah, just our inability to have the real difficult conversations that we need to be having.
Thank you. I'd like to share with people another quote from the book. You kind of get into the idea of the charge of disturbing the peace, and you talk about that, let's see here, let me grab this. So you say, when we use nonviolence to confront violence and injustice, we are not disturbing the peace, we are disturbing complacency. You go on to say, we are disturbing the normalization of violence. We are disturbing negative peace. When massive homeless encampments become normalized, we need to disturb that. When we accept a 50% dropout rate from urban high schools, we need to disturb that. When we invest in a prison system that produces an 83% recidivism rate, we need to disturb that. When corporate interests are destroying our planet and endangering the livelihoods of future generations, we need to disturb that. And of course, we need to disturb the fact that racism is alive and well in the United States. So what can people take from this potent book into action? Like, let's just say, some of us have not had any training in nonviolence, maybe a little bit of an idea of NVC, nonviolent communication. So what would you hope that we could do in just viable steps towards taking action? And I know that this next book that you're bringing out is going to be addressing that also. But what are some practical steps for people here?
Yeah.
Right away.
I suppose I could say two things. One is, as a trainer and as someone who has like launched different organizations and networks and things like that, one of the hardest things that I've had to accept is that the things that I bring out into the world, whether it's a new organization or just a one-day workshop, like there's no guarantee that I'm not going to cause harm and that I'm not going to mess up. Like I've messed up. I mess up probably every single workshop I facilitate in some way and cause harm in some way. And I think sometimes we're so scared to mess up that it leads to inaction. Mm-hmm. And I was having a conversation with my colleague the other day, and he says that, as someone who's deeply committed to nonviolence himself, he's less interested these days in the debate between violence and nonviolence and more interested in the debate between action and inaction. And so I think we need to be okay with things being messy. We need to be okay even like not knowing what to do, but to try to do something anyways, right? Mm. And I think, I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of months, as most of us have been mostly home, about what it means to engage in the work of nonviolence right now. Mm-hmm. And I think I've personally been, trying to find like safe ways to be in the streets and things like that, but also really focusing on my own healing, because one of the things that I've noticed is, in nonviolence, we teach that our nonviolent responses to conflict has to match the escalation of conflict that we're responding to, right? So this is why I always say that like filling out a petition for the Black Lives Matter movement is not the appropriate response, because you're responding to an incredibly heightened level of violence. And so a more appropriate response to police killings of unarmed Black folks might be to occupy a highway. And at the same time, I've noticed that the more we escalate our tactics of nonviolence, the more we also tend to escalate polarization, and the more we tend to escalate this us versus them, right versus wrong worldview. And I think it's that binary worldview that is at the heart of what is destroying this planet. And so how do we get to a place where we can be leading powerful movements that use militant forms of nonviolent direct action to respond to the heightened level of crisis, while doubling down on a commitment to healing and doubling down on a commitment to restoring relationships? And I think that if we're not doing our own work of trauma healing and reconnecting with our families and kind of becoming whole again as individuals, then when we're out in the streets and the emotions are escalated, that it's really easy for us to get triggered and kind of veer away from our values. And so I think it's those two things of like making sure that we're doing our own work and not pretending that, oh, because I'm a nonviolent person and I'm a restorative justice practitioner,
Right.
I don't need to do any work. Like it's those people
Yeah.
that need to do work. I think
Yeah.
it's important for all of us to be doing our work and then go out into the streets and not be scared to mess up.
Thank you so much for acknowledging that. I'm noticing that in myself, in this movement. And people, I really appreciate how much people are waking up to what you've just said too. Like it seems so obvious, and yet it's like the most critical nonviolence work that we can do is to show up as whole as we can. And when we mess up, and like you were saying, when we cause harm, whether we, most of it is unintentional and due to bias that we don't even know we have. And there's other reasons for it too, but that can we hold one another in a way that acknowledges that that's a fact of our existence, that we have shame, that we have trauma, each of us. It's not like it's out there, like you're saying. So it's that's such a critical piece of this. So I want to just make sure that we have another moment, Kazu, to cover anything else you'd like to share about the book itself, and then shift into some interaction with our community tonight.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot there, but I think the core like essence of the book is about in my own path noticing that a lot of like resistance movements, like sometimes there's like lip service paid to the idea of healing or the idea of reconciliation. Like in a lot of social justice movements, there's that famous quote from the Aboriginal people of Australia that says that if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound with mine, then we can walk together. And that's a really common like framing in a lot of activist circles. But in my experience, in a lot of activist communities, people don't actually believe that. It's like my liberation is bound with the liberation of people that I agree with, but my liberation is at the expense of those people over there. And I think so much of the work of nonviolence and really of restorative justice is this deep, unwavering faith in the idea of interdependence, right? That when we talk about our liberation is bound with the liberation of all people, we really mean all people. And so how do we hold the tension of needing to stop the systems of injustice and violence in its tracks and saying enough, no, like this has to stop, while holding the dignity of all people and realizing that this kind of binary way of saying you're the oppressor, I'm the oppressed, you're the victim, you're the perpetrator, it's a false dichotomy. Like we're all getting hurt, violence affects all of us, and we need to find a way to truly liberate all people on all sides of conflict.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kazu. I was so delighted that you were willing to come and visit with us. And it's an honor, really, to engage with people like yourself and all of our people in the learning community and participant community tonight. Just a reminder, if you're joining us a little bit late, we're with Kazu Haga, and we're discussing his book, Healing Resistance. And we're going to open it up now for a little bit of conversation together. So if you'd like to turn your video back on, please do so now. And just a reminder that you can get your copy of the book, or multiple copies, even better, at Parallax Press, where there will be donations per each book ordered to an incarcerated person. That's a wonderful benefit of supporting the press and of our people behind bars, who are also our community. So just a quick guideline and norm for tonight's discussion with Kazu. We have about 35 minutes allocated to this time. If we have time and it seems like it might be relevant for us together, we might go into breakouts, but we really wanted to honor people's voice tonight. So questions can come in either through video or through the chat. If you do ask a question live, if you would please be willing to be mindful of sharing from your heart respectfully, and of the time that we have to engage, so that others can do the same. And that's about it. So I will be watching the chat, and we'll have a conversation with Kazu now. And I'll start it out by just inviting someone to go ahead and turn on their video and begin with a question by video. Welcome.
Hello, I have a question, if I may. It's
Please, Sue, welcome.
Thank you. I attended a workshop with Kit Miller at the Gandhi Institute, reading your book, Healing Resistance. And you actually graced our workshop the last session by attending it with you. I want to appreciate that very much. I've been doing quite intense work in the nonviolent anti-racist movement, and they dovetail very nicely. I'm wondering, as I listen to many of our Black friends talking about the pain, letting the pain of their experience coming up over generations that they're carrying, I'm feeling that the time for a truth and reconciliation process here in America has arrived. And I'm wondering if anybody has approached you to participate in a movement like that, the truth and reconciliation process.
Thank you. I mean, I've never been approached directly about a process like that. I've had conversations with many people about the need for something like that. I would just urge us to keep in mind that, I think I'm not an expert on the truth and reconciliation processes that happen in South Africa, but as someone who is kind of very much on the outside looking in, I think one of the things that I would have loved to have seen in that is, truth telling in and of itself is not enough for reconciliation. Like, accountability is a prerequisite to reconciliation. And so I think, in addition to this country really finding out about, because this is one of the things I listen to a lot of conservative podcasts as part of my nonviolence practice. I try to really take in information from the other side, and it's becoming very clear to me that the vast majority of this country, actually probably even people on the left too, right, we actually don't know US history at all. Like, when we talk about the history of particularly Black people in this country, we have no idea what has happened. And so part of it has to be that we have to tell the truth about the history of this country. And it's painful. But it can't be enough just to tell the truth and then leave it at that, right? And so, I want to give a plug for a project that I'm supporting right now called the Reparations Procession, where white people in the East Bay every day are walking 8.5 miles a day, wearing all Black, wearing a veil, in total silence, from the site of an ancient sacred indigenous land to Fruitvale Station, which is where Oscar Grant was murdered, 8.5 miles every single day, trying to raise money for reparations. And I think that kind of project of real mourning and atonement, but also concrete acts of accountability is really important. So yeah, truth telling and reparations and atonement all have to be part of that process for reconciliation.
And actually, there's no law that says we have to follow exactly the model that was done in South Africa, or the model that's been done with Indigenous people in Canada. We can actually innovate a model that does synthesize all of these things and more, the things that you'd suggest. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to participate in that.
If there's an opportunity, I see Donna saying that Fania Davis from Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth has talked about national Truth and Reconciliation commissions in the country. And also that quote about shame is, I believe it's from Stacey Haynes, who says, shame derives its power from being unspoken. It might be from Brene Brown. It's probably one of those two. Oh, and Donna had that too, yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Mitra, are you ready? And my apologies, I'm not sure why the video aspect of some people's turning it back on is saying that I'm blocking it. I apologize for that. I'm not sure why. So I'm going through and asking you to turn your video back on. Let's see here. So Mitra, you're next, and then I'm going to take a question from the chat after that from Sean.
Hi, peace be with everyone. I consider myself a proactive pacifist, and at this point, I don't know at what point I've kind of tipped over, and I feel a lot of internal anger with everything that's going on, mainly because as a moral response, I think it's okay to feel that anger, but other than meditation, I'm really not processing everything that's going on very well. So I don't even feel like a nonviolent activist at this point. I don't feel like it's fair to speak out about nonviolence when I internally I'm not dealing with it very well. Is there anything you could speak about that?
Yeah, I think the importance of like rage and grief work, like I think there's never been a time when that's needed. I think, I oftentimes talk about how there's also this misunderstanding in nonviolence that like nonviolence is about not being angry. And I think that's dangerous. I oftentimes talk about how I think King was one of the most pissed off people in the country at the time because he was deeply aware of the injustices, and I think it pissed him off, right? And I think particularly for like Black and brown communities right now, I think there's a real need for creating safe containers to just fully be in their rage and in our rage. And I think we need to create safe containers for that, because in my opinion, like without casting any judgment on it, the streets is not a safe place to process trauma. Right? So like we need to create containers in our own movements where people can just like go fully into their rage, because if we don't release it, it's gonna be there and it's gonna get repressed and it's gonna get released somewhere else. And so I really urge, and I think this is where a lot of like restorative justice facilitators can really come in, right? Because I think grief tending, rage tending is really tricky work. And I oftentimes describe it as, not that different than performing an operation. That like, if you're going to perform surgery on someone, you really need to know what you're doing. And I think a lot of restorative justice practitioners have great skills in tending to really difficult emotions. So I think if you're a restorative justice facilitator, to offer your service in social justice movements where people are actually going into the streets and all this rage and grief and all these emotions are coming up, we need to create spaces for that emotion to just be released, but it needs to happen in safe containers, right? So.
All right, thank you. I'd like to honor Sean's question in the chat to mix it up a little, and then we'll go to Noel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Noel. So Sean asks, Kazu, after reading your book and being inspired by it, I started doing some of the nonviolence weight training you suggested in the appendix. Specifically, I started following right-wing Twitter accounts and began interacting with many of the people who participate in those discussions, who are mostly right-wing. While I've had many wonderful conversations with people that have resulted in some surprising discoveries of commonality, I find myself suffering emotionally as a result of these interactions. Is there anything I can do to counteract this? Am I doing it wrong? Should I start with something less intense? Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I'd use the language of wrong, but a couple of things I'd say on that. One is I'm glad that you've gotten some helpful interactions from the folks that you're talking to, but for the most part, I would lean against interacting with people on social media. I think social media is the worst place to try to resolve conflicts and to try to speak across differences. So that would be one thing. And also, you know, as I shared, I do spend a lot of time listening to conservative podcasts and things like that. But I've also had to learn, like early on, I was listening to people like Milo Yiannopoulos and realizing that that was actually not beneficial to me. That, like, you know, we like the right wing is a very big umbrella also, right? And there are people on the right that I really find to be very intelligent and well thought out thinkers that I just happen to disagree with. And so on the spectrum with like Alex Jones or someone, or like Rush Limbaugh being way over on the right, there are people who are closer to the center that you can start with. I like to listen to a lot of debate shows. Like Left, Right, and Center is a great podcast that I listen to. Intelligence Squared is also a great resource for a lot of like great long form debates. So starting there might be good as well. But yeah, like be discerning in the right wingers that you follow, because not all of them are going to be that productive.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. So Noel, are you with us?
I
And then
am. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kazu. I'm just hanging on your every word and looking forward to getting your book. I'm wondering if you feel that this is perhaps a unique in-between time. And to me, it feels that your suggestion of avoiding binary thinking is really helpful. And specifically, I work within a prison system, and I struggle sometimes being an abolitionist while being inside a prison. And I'm wondering too, locally in my community, as we're working towards divestment from police, how we stand in this in-between time to create an equitable justice for everyone focused system while we still rely on police for safety. How can you speak to this in-between time?
Yeah, it is a real challenge, I think, for a lot of people who, myself included, who identify as abolitionists and also work within the system, right? Because I also do some work with law enforcement. I've done trauma healing workshops with law enforcement and things like that. And I think part of it is like, I think I might have wrote about this in my book. I don't remember, but I had a really difficult experience once of having had to call the police on a family member of mine. And it was because this person was threatening the life of another family member, and they were 3,000 miles away in a place that I didn't know anyone. There were no restorative justice resources that I could know about. And this, like, a person's life was in danger. And so I called the police, which ended up in him getting incarcerated for a couple of years, but I didn't know what else to do, right? And it was like, as a police abolitionist, as a prison abolitionist, it's like, I'm calling the police and getting a family member of mine locked up. And I think what that spoke to is the fact that we as a community are actually not ready for abolition. And I think, like, as much grief as I have in saying that, like, I think we have to realize that, like, until our communities are actually ready to take care of our own communities without relying on the police, there's going to be moments where it feels like there's no other option. So I think the more we can invest in real community alternatives, like, I think the defund the police movement is really great, because it's not just about saying, like, we're going to defund the police and there's going to be no police next year and that's going to be it. But it's like, what are the resources that we need to invest in our community so that we can rely on them less? And I think it's going to have to be a more gradual process than we would perhaps like. And yeah, it's just like this is an intergenerational struggle, right? It's going to take a long time. And I do think we're in this moment where, like, change happens really slowly and incrementally until we get to these moments in history where we're able to make these huge leaps. So I feel like we're in that moment where we're about to make a huge leap towards abolition, but we also have to be okay with the fact that it's not going to be tomorrow, you know, and really start to invest in resources so that we can get as far as we can in that path.
Thank you. another video question for those who are comfortable speaking on video. And certainly if you're not, that's fine too. Just want to honor the space to chime in as you feel comfortable.
My grandmother's hands. I actually have that book. I haven't read it yet. Everyone is telling me I have to read that book, right? Clearly that has to be the next book on my list.
Kazu, there was something I wanted to highlight, but also ask you. A lot of the words that have been used recently can be really triggering, like the word defund, for example, is obviously triggering to some people who make their living off of being a policeman or a policewoman. And one of the things I'm noticing is that there's the binary that's created is police or not police, or you're either with the police or you're against the police. And we don't really talk much about the institution rather than the individuals. And it just seems to focus so much on individuals and so difficult to get people to see outside of that. And I'm wondering if you have ways that you address that.
I actually don't think we see individuals either. And what I mean by that is, this is something I wrote about in my book. A great example is a police officer named Eric Casebolt. Some of you may remember an incident a few years ago in Texas where there was a pool party and a bunch of teenagers were hanging out, and apparently there were too many black teenagers who were hanging out, so someone called the police. And this officer named Eric Casebolt, as soon as he showed up on the scene, just all hell broke loose. And at one point, he grabbed a young girl by her braids who was probably like 14 years old and weighed 100 pounds and threw her on the ground. At another point, he actually took out his gun, not his taser, his gun, and started aiming it at these teenagers who were running around. And one of the things that I learned when looking into that incident is that that was the third call that Casebolt had received that day. The first call that he received that morning was a suicide watch where he was called to the scene and he watched a man blow his own brains out in front of his wife, and he had to clean that up and console the man's wife. And right afterwards, he was called to another suicide watch where he had to talk a young girl down from a ledge and talk a young girl from killing herself in front of her family by jumping off of a ledge. And then he got called to the pool party. And he says that, that doesn't condone anything that he did, but what that shows me is that the system of policing didn't care enough about Eric Casebolt's mental health to give him the rest of the day off. Right? And so the system of policing is hurting everybody. Like police officers, I think, as I start doing like trauma healing workshops with prison guards and police officers, I think part of it is getting them out of this like macho patriarchal culture of saying like, I'm tough and this isn't affecting me and on to the next thing. And getting police officers to realize like, oh, this system is killing us. Right? And that like part of like, I think the anti-war movement since Vietnam has made a lot of great leaps in being able to separate out, like, we're not against the soldiers, we're actually supporting the soldiers. And it's that reason why we don't want them to go to war. Right. But we haven't been able to make that transition with law enforcement. And I understand why. It's because law enforcement is a domestic force. So the violence that they perpetuate, like we experience certain communities more than others. So I get why it's harder to make that transition, but I think that's part of the work that we need to do is to understand that the institution of policing is hurting everybody. And when we're talking about defunding police, it's actually for their mental health as well. And in that process, I think you're right that we do need to make sure, just like with the oil industry and the climate change movement, we need to make sure that we're giving people an out, right? And we're not just gonna like defund the police department and all these people are going to be out of a job and we're not going to support them at all. But what are ways that we can transition them so that they can continue to earn a living? I think it's really important.
It's the taking things literally. Whenever you hear defund, people take that literally, like take everything away. Thank you.
Kazu, I'd like to make one quick comment because I'm very inexperienced. I don't want to take up anybody's time. But one of my real goals, and I'm just studying right now, is just what you mentioned. I thought it was a pipe dream. I'm a prison volunteer. And I thought if we could incorporate restorative justice into the training for correction officers, they're already in place all over the workplace, and they could be part of the solution instead of part of the problem while we're trying to transition into changing who goes to prison and et cetera. But I just wanted to say that I'm hoping I can learn from people like you that have that vision, how it can actually be implemented. If you have anything you want to say, or I just need a list.
Yeah, no, thank you. There's a great book by a guy named Bill Moyer, not the PBS Bill Moyer, called Doing Democracy. And in the book, he talks about the difference between reformist reform and abolitionist reform, or revolutionary reform. Sorry, reformist reform and reformist reform and revolutionary reform. And I think when we start thinking about doing trainings, restorative justice trainings for prison guards and things like that, I think it's great as long as we don't lose our sight on like the ultimate transformation that we want to see, which for me is prison abolition, right? That like we're doing this so that we can set the stage for a much larger transformation. And it's not just going to be enough to have like nicer prison guards, because then we're still locking people up, and that in and of itself is a violent act. And so as long as we don't lose sight of the goal, I think in the meantime, it would be great if, I actually just got a call right before this call from a friend of mine whose husband is locked up and is one of our trainers in a prison in California, and just experienced a pretty brutal incident with prison guards there. So obviously there's a lot of immediate work that needs to happen around that.
One of our colleagues in Oakland, Zach Norris, has a wonderful book on that topic, really, looking at how we keep us safe. He was a former guest on this podcast and dialogue series, for those who might be interested. You can look him up in our archives. Just a shout out to him. What a wonderful human being. More questions, video or chat?
Hi, Molly, it's Camille. May I ask a question, please?
Absolutely, welcome.
Sure. Hi, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Kazu. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your knowledge base and sharing with us tonight. One of the things that I wanted to comment on was when you spoke earlier about the riots and the protests, and there not being an understanding around the root cause, right? What we see in the street sometimes are just the aftermaths or the effects, and not being able to understand the root cause and the historical context of the rage. So I really appreciate how you defined it, because what we fail to realize at times is that what the mind cannot contain, right, it comes out in the body, and that all behavior has meaning. And so other than looking at what people see as the aftermath or the damage, right, it shifts the focus on what is really the genesis of this rage. And if people were able to just really understand, again, the years and years of rage and years of violence and injustice and societal unrest, I think there would definitely be a different level of understanding whereby people can come to, the table together. And so what do you think, especially as it pertains to young people who are seeing this and who are trying to find their lane of agency? What can you say to young people in schools or educators to help their young people process what is going on? I'm sorry, I know it was a long question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's tough for young people right now, isn't it? Because we live in such a polarized world. There's seemingly no nuance to everything. I think ultimately social media is like horrible for society and humanity. And so I have a lot of empathy for young people right now, as well as educators and people who work with young people. I think that one of the biggest things, the biggest challenges right now is our inability to see nuance. And so I think for young people to try to see as much nuance as possible, for educators to try to introduce as much nuance as possible. And like you were saying, to look into history. I was just listening to an interview that Brian Stevenson was doing, and he was talking about how, I think I was sharing this earlier too, that just this country doesn't know its own history. And if we don't know our own history, then like, why would we be surprised if a certain group of the population doesn't understand why the Black Lives Matter movement is necessary, right? And so like studying deeply into history that is beyond just the traditional textbooks. And, you know, there's still a lot of elders who have a lot of wisdom. And I think a lot of, this is starting to shift a little bit, but when I started to get involved in youth justice work decades ago, I feel like part of the messaging was like, young people can do it on their own. And we want to empower young people to be the leaders of movements, because historically young people have always led movements, but at the same time, historically, it's always been in relationship with elders. And I feel like sometimes that gets lost. And so the importance of intergenerational organizing, I think, is really key as well.
Thank you so much for that.
I'm going to change the order real quick. Isa, are you ready to share? And welcome.
Yes.
Great. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. My name is Isa Nichols, and
Isa.
that's okay. Kat, how are you doing this evening? Thank you for, and this little girl right here is my granddaughter, Tara, who has joined me. I wanted to know, I'm a survivor, and I do survivor engagement work. Back in 2002, there was a bullet meant for me, the DC snipers, John Muhammad and Lee Boy Malvo. The first murder occurred at my front door in Tacoma, Washington. So it's been a journey that happened in 2002. And then today I work in survivor engagement work because one of the perpetrators was a youth, a 16-year-old boy, Lee Malvo. I began working with the school to prison pipeline as a result of somewhere to place my pain and my trauma into something positive. Today, 18 years later, I'm still doing survivor engagement work. I've written a book called Truth and Reconciliation Through Traumatic Experiences. And it's just a guide, because I don't believe anyone can have, or there's a set principles that people can follow, meaning there's not one size that fits all. And so I would like to understand if you have, and I haven't read your book, but I will. I'm going to get that book. But I'm just kind of reading about you or hearing about you today, a little bit about your bio, and I'm very interested on how forgiveness plays in any of your reconciliation traumatic work against traumatic experiences that you do with clients and that you do with agencies when you're working within any system. Because I believe that the foundation really lies with your ability at some point to embrace forgiveness. First, got to start with yourself and then go from there.
Yeah, thank you for the question, as well as for the work that you're doing, particularly given the where it comes from. You know, I definitely remember that time in our country felt really scary. So yeah, thank you for turning that experience
Very
into something so beautiful.
Very traumatic for the whole country. Yes.
Yeah. In terms of forgiveness, it's never a stated like goal when I start facilitating dialogues that like I want you to get to a place of forgiveness, because I think sometimes we put too much pressure on people to like, oh, you need to forgive, you're nonviolent, this is restorative justice, so you need to forgive. And I think forgiveness oftentimes only comes at the end of being able to honor where people are at, and sometimes where people are at are like, F forgiveness, I want to kill this MFer, and I think we need to create space to like hold that, right? Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, as many people in restorative justice work say, that you know, forgiveness is not about the person that you're trying to forgive. It's actually so that you can lift the burden off of yourself. There's a beautiful quote that comes out of this 12-step tradition that says like that hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That when we're not able to forgive someone, that like that person that you're hating on is probably having a wonderful day, not even thinking about you. And meanwhile, you can't move forward in life. You can't do anything productive in life. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that yeah, for someone who caused harm, it is definitely nice to hear forgiveness from the other side. I think it can go a long ways in towards the path of their own healing. But ultimately, it has to be something that you do for yourself, right? It has to be something that you do so that you can move forward in life, and understanding that, like, no matter what happens with the other side, with the other person, like, whatever happens with the other person, like, your healing is not dependent on anything that happens over there. Your healing is only dependent on what happens inside of you. And so, yeah, realizing that forgiveness is something that you need to do for yourself, and not thinking like, oh, it's something something nice I have to do for another person, and taking that pressure off of doing something for anyone else.
Yes, I agree, because a lot of the issues and what's on the forefront of the plate today are not new. Racism, uh, police brutality, it's not new. It's been here, instilled, interwoven into American society. It's just now revolving just as much as it did when Emmett Till was, his mother decided to have an open casket funeral when he was murdered. Well, we watched 8.5 minutes of George Floyd all these years later being murdered right in front of us. So as a survivor and as family members of victims, the forgiveness piece is really hard. I remember that's where I had to begin before I could ever think of doing any of the work that I was doing now. You talked about wholeness, or someone talked about wholeness, and that comes with re-engagement. I feel that what you're saying, the sets a construct for this. You used the word container. I really think that's a good use of words, because in America, we do need pockets of containers that are out there to deal with the race, to deal with the distrust, to deal with all of the movements that's going on. When you say all life matters, you can't have all lives if you leave out any other lives pertaining, particularly Black lives. So I just want to interject the language of forgiveness in there, because at some point in time, there's got to be some truth telling. I engage people in the truth is ... because my truth is not going to be your truth is not going to be my truth. But there is a truth to everyone. If they're willing to, you can get someone to say what they even think their truth is. That's a breakthrough. And if you can start with the truth and then move on into owning your truth, whatever it is, whether it is white supremacy, whether it's racism, whether it's cognitive dissonance, it doesn't matter. The truth will be indicative to dealing with your forgiveness, and then being able to be in a position to create some container to get to your wholeness. And then at that particular time, we can do some really restorative, re-engaging work. I've been, since 2002, since the murder of my niece by Lee Boy Malvo and John Muhammad, I have been just going over and over and over what I can do to deal with my pain. At some point, it was very traumatic. And trauma traumatizes, the traumatization on several levels. I now have grandchildren who are the second generation from me. And I have to teach them about forgiveness and about how they can live in a world that may bring harm to them someday. For any reason, or maybe not even a reason they know. They could be driving in a car and get stopped by the police today. So as we look at the traumatizations and how trauma traumatizes, I just wanted to get kind of what your take was on starting with the forgiveness piece, and how do you parlay, if at all, any of that in your work?
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
And thank you for answering my questions.
Yeah. And, I oftentimes use kind of a mathematical formula of like forgiveness and accountability equals reconciliation, right? And those are, not every conflict, even in a restorative process, is going to be reconciled. And like I said, our healing isn't dependent on what anyone else does. So if you caused harm, you can get to accountability without forgiveness. And if you experienced harm, you can get to forgiveness without accountability. And I think in restorative justice at its best, we're moving towards reconciliation, which accountability and forgiveness are the prerequisites, I think. So
it's funny you said that, because I am an accountant by trade, so I deal in balance sheets and things balancing on one side to the next, and I do use creation equals restoration and redemption. It's kind of like the other side, the balancing act of it all.
People are asking about your book. Would you be willing to put your book in the chat?
Oh,
yes.
Certainly.
Yeah, someone did, I think.
Kat's book is in there.
Is it Genesis, the bullet that was meant for me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
I put it in the chat, Molly.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I have a second book that's coming out probably in October through December timeframe. It's called Restore, Truth and Reconciliation Through Traumatic Experiences. And it is the journey of my restoration from that tragedy of Genesis, the bullet was meant for me.
Thank you so much. Can't say that with words.
Well,
really.
you're welcome. I really appreciate this forum and bringing this man to the table, because I had not heard of his work. However, when I got the link and did a little bit of reading, I said, oh, this is a must see. I'm on the East Coast, so it's, it was kind of late than most of my West Coast brothers and sisters.
and on that note, this will be dropped on the podcast for those of you that might be curious, to pass it on to anyone you think might like to listen to it after the fact. We'll also share the video out to the email list that registered for this event. So you'll get it in multiple forms, and it's Creative Commons. Please pass it along. I know we're over time right now. Kazu, can we take one more question and then
yeah, of course.
wrap it up? Yeah, I know we're at 1:15 was kind of our target for tonight, but I think, let's see, Amanda, you were next, and then there's some wonderful comments in the chat too. And those of you who might want to chime in from the chat by voice, certainly you're welcome to do that. Amanda, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Kazu, it's so good to see you. And I remember meeting you in 2011 when you came to Occupy in Seattle and kind of help that from falling apart, because there was a lot of stuff online and a lot of chaos, mostly online. And I think you helped me and some others kind of work through that. So I'm so glad to have met you then. And I want to echo what you said about elders and honoring the elders, because I'm over 60. So I'm an elder, and I'm very much still in the fight. And this last movement seems to be more willing than, say, Occupy or maybe the Sunrise movement, and welcoming in elders and just, listening to us. So that feels good. That's very gratifying. And finally, my main point was not really a question, but I worry about infiltrators when movements come up. And I worried about that with when this latest uprising or protest started, because I saw what I thought was a lot of infiltrating going on, and I was worried that it was going to undermine the whole thing, because I could see it was important and building and growing. But that doesn't seem so much like an issue anymore. But do you have any thoughts on that, how to deal with that, what to look for?
Yeah, couple of things. Again, I think there's like the non-dual nature of looking at things, because on the one hand, one of my mentors once told me that he said that accusations of infiltration have destroyed as many movements as infiltrators have. And I actually saw that a lot in Occupy and in a lot of movements too. So I think like we need to be really careful about accusations of infiltration. And I think sometimes in our movements, we get really paranoid, and that paranoia makes us distrust each other, and then we fall apart even when there wasn't any infiltrators. And at the same time, we know the history of COINTELPRO, and we know just like the madness that is happening in the world today. And so I think, someone posted on the chat way earlier that quote, that I think it's biblical initially, but Adrienne Marie Brown has popularized it again, moving at the speed of relationship. And so really focusing on building relationships with the people that we're organizing with, I think is really important. And that kind of relational organizing, if we're not honoring the relationships that we're building. And, I want to engage in social change work. I want to engage in direct action work, but I only want to do that with people that, that I've cried with, that I've healed with, that I've been in circle with, right? And so I think the more we can infuse practices of restorative justice into social justice work, I think the more powerful and the safer we'll be from things like infiltration.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you so much to everyone that has had comments and questions. I think that Tina had one that I think would be a nice wrap up tonight, Kazu. And then it would be interesting to know how people can continue to engage with you and in what form. So let's come back to Tina's question. I had it prompted here. It's about viable action, examples of, so she asks, do you have any other examples of symbolic action, like the 8.5 mile daily march in Oakland, that will make a difference? So as we close out tonight, some ideas for actions that people can think about taking.
I'm going to answer the question maybe a little bit differently than what you wanted, so my apologies.
That's okay. Please do.
When we think of viable actions, when we think of what are the most effective actions that we can take right now, I usually have this image of being in a room with a group of activists with like flip chart paper everywhere and all these like data analysis and research and what's the most effective target and what's the best strategy to gain the most leverage and pressure and how do we apply that pressure to the target. And I actually want to suggest that that's not what's going to create transformation. I think that we have a tendency to think that we can think our way out of this problem. And I think that's part of the problem. Right? And I think we need to learn to listen from our heart. And the reparations procession is more ritual and prayer than it is a form of action in the sense, right? Like, I mean, we're raising money, so there's going to be some impact, but the people that are organizing it are very clear that like whether we raise $50,000 or we raise $1 million, we are here to atone. We are here to mourn the legacy of white supremacy as white people because it's a project that is being led by white people. And so I think what I want to suggest is to not think about what kind of impact is this going to have, what level of power are we going to be able to create, but just to like listen deeply into our hearts and do the action that we feel called to do in that moment. And maybe it'll lead to abolition, maybe it won't, but I think as long as we're thinking of like what's the best way to get to this prescribed outcome, we're not going to get there. And I think we need to learn to listen to our heart and to learn to listen to emergence a little bit more in these times.
That's perfect. It really is. I mean, thank you. Thank you for bringing us back to that space. It's the ground of being for everything else as a result of going inward. So I just want to thank you, Kazu, from the heart. Thank you so much. It's been incredible, and I know that there's a lot of questions that probably have been left unanswered. But one thing that I would like to commit to as your host is to sharing the chat with Kazu so that maybe you could look at what else people had to say. So if you still have a question or a comment that you'd like to make sure that gets to Kazu, please put that in there before we close tonight. And just a reminder too, again, I know I've said it a lot, but please buy multiple copies of the book at Parallax Press. I just really appreciate that they're doing that effort to donate books to incarcerated persons. Very near and dear to my heart, and actually is part of what inspired my work in this field too, is having a loved one incarcerated for 15 years, including solitary. So Kazu, closing reflections, closing word, anything that we wanted to wrap up with before we close out tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I think if, coronavirus has shown anything and has taught us anything, it is how deeply interdependent we are, that, the virus cares nothing about political affiliation or nation states or any of that, right? And so I think as much as like sickness can spread virally like that, I believe liberation can too. And so I think it's a real opportunity for us to think much bigger than what we might have thought of before coronavirus. And so, yeah, just to continue to listen to our heart and continue to do what our heart calls us to do. And I think, I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm really optimistic about these times. It's scary times, but I think we're going to come out of this in a better place. So thank you all for being here tonight.
And how can people get in touch with you, Kazu? Through your website?
Yeah, so East Point Peace Academy, it's a play on words of the military academy at West Point. So West Point Military Academy, East Point Peace Academy, eastpointpeace.org is our website, and healingresistance.com is the website for the book, and there's a link to the Parallax page.
Wonderful. And finally, when is the next one due out? I believe you
We're
said.
aiming for fall of next year.
Okay.
It's called Fierce Vulnerability, so be on the lookout for that.
Definitely. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of this extraordinary conversation, and hope to see you again soon in the dialogue space that we've created together. Thank you for being beloved community, and just wanting to give a special heartfelt shout out to our friends in India who were with us tonight, and to the support of Camille Jacobs, who is a wonderful community member and participant in and host in Restorative Justice on the Rise webinars that we've been conducting. So thank you, Camille, and thank you everyone who makes this a people's platform, which is the whole point. So thank you, Kazu. Good night, everyone. Look out for this on the podcast, and you'll get an email with the recording to pass along to your friends, neighbors, and community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Molly.
Good night, Molly. Thank you. Thank you, Kazu.